What's up, dogs? Today we're going to start examining moral naturalism. So I'm finally getting around to continuing the Intro to Metaethics series. Now, I should say it's been so long since I've done anything on this series that I can't really remember what material I've covered previously. So I might end up in these videos going over topics that we've already done. I will include in the description a video content which will allow you to skip over any sections that you're already familiar with. So first of all, let's define our terminology. Moral naturalism is a form of moral realism, which is to say that moral naturalism is committed to three claims. First, moral naturalism is a form of cognitivism. Naturalists hold that moral judgments express beliefs which are truth-apt. Second, some of these beliefs are in fact true. And third, the truth or falsehood of moral beliefs is in a sense determined by mind-independent states of affairs. The important point here is that in principle, at least, everybody might be mistaken about whether or not some moral claim is true. So slavery is wrong, and slavery would still be wrong even if everybody thought otherwise. So those are the three basic claims of moral realism. And, well, we've already examined one form of moral realism in the previous videos where we looked at moral non-naturalism. What moral naturalists add to these three basic claims, as the name suggests, is that the objective moral facts are natural facts. Moral properties are natural properties. And that immediately raises the question, well, what are natural properties? So I think we've talked about this before in the series, but since we're actually looking at moral naturalism today, it's worth saying a little bit more about it. One initial way to characterize moral properties is that they are properties that are studied by the natural sciences. All other properties then reduce to or arise out of these properties studied by the sciences. And an assumption that's shared by most naturalists, pretty much all naturalists actually, is that the world is ultimately constituted out of combinations of fundamental physical particles. And this isn't to say that we can talk about everything using just the language and theories of physics, but it's that ultimately everything there is built up out of these fundamental physical particles. Compare, for example, how biological properties are constituted by physical properties. We may not be able to fully explain biology in terms of physics, in the sense that we can't describe all biological phenomena just in physical terms. Nevertheless, we think that all biological organisms are ultimately built out of the fundamental physical particles described by physics. It would be hopelessly complex to even attempt to describe a biological organism just in terms of the arrangement of fundamental particles, but really that's all there is. Biological properties are like patterns in physical properties. So similarly, according to moral naturalists, moral judgments concern properties that are just like the properties studied by respectable sciences like biology, psychology, and so on. A slightly different way to characterize natural properties would be to say that they are properties that are causally efficacious. Natural properties are properties that have causes and effects. And as we'll see, moral naturalists really want to vindicate the idea that goodness and badness have a causal impact on the world. So, for example, they will say things like that the opposition to slavery was partially caused by the evils of slavery. Another way to characterize natural properties is just to say that these are the properties expressed by non-normative terms. So the properties referred to by terms like water and pleasure, gold, orange, and so on. All of these terms are non-normative in that they don't in themselves imply anything about what ought to be done. So the naturalist is saying that moral properties are constituted by the properties referred to by such terms. Now, there are difficulties with all of these ways of defining natural properties, and in fact you shouldn't take any of these as giving a definition. The idea is that this should give you some idea of what the naturalist has in mind. And I mean, with this understanding then of natural properties in mind, we can tease out two claims that the moral naturalist makes. First, there's the metaphysical claim that moral properties are natural properties. That's a claim about moral ontology. And second, many moral naturalists make an epistemological claim that moral beliefs are justified in pretty much the same way as other empirical beliefs are justified. in order to figure out what the moral facts actually are, we need to apply what are, broadly speaking, the same kind of empirical methods that are used in biology, psychology, and so on. We learn about moral properties in the same kind of way that we learn about everyday natural properties. So overall then, moral naturalism might be defined as the view that morality is continuous with the sciences, both in its subject matter and in its methodology. Now, broadly speaking, there are two forms of moral naturalism. First, reductionist forms of moral naturalism suppose that moral vocabulary is analysable in terms of non-moral vocabulary. Moral claims are synonymous in terms of meaning with certain of the claims of natural sciences. Or at the very least, for central moral terms, we can specify non-moral terms that refer to the same thing. Basically, the reductionist approach supposes not only that moral properties are natural properties, but that we have non-moral terms for these natural properties. This is sometimes called analytic naturalism. Somebody, for instance, with utilitarian inclinations might say that goodness is just pleasure, and that morally right action is just whatever maximizes pleasure. That permits a reductionist naturalism because we're just identifying moral goodness with the natural property of pleasure. By contrast, non-reductionist moral naturalism holds that although moral properties are constituted by natural properties, we can't reduce moral language to non-moral language. Moral properties may be multiply realised by other natural properties. So Alex Miller, in his introduction to Metaethics, gives the example of moral rightness. He says if we take one example of moral rightness, we might identify it with some natural property, say handing over of money from a well-off person to a homeless person. Right, that's a purely natural process, and we might say that's one example of a morally right action. But if we consider all morally right actions, there's no one property or set of properties that all of these actions have in common. We're not going to be able to say, oh well, what makes all of these actions morally right is that they maximize pleasure. Actions can be right for many different reasons, and this is sometimes called synthetic naturalism. Perhaps one way to understand the distinction here would be to compare it to reductionism in other areas. So for those of you familiar with philosophy of mind, you'll recall that identity theorists are reductionists. They say that types of mental state are identical to types of brain state. So pain, for instance, just is the firing of C fibres, or something along those lines. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the mental state and the brain state. That's analogous to the reductionist moral naturalist, where we can specify some natural property for each moral property. By contrast, somebody who's attracted to functionalism in philosophy of mind will say that a mental state like pain can be realised by a wide variety of physical states, not just human brains, but also robots, aliens, octopodes, and other creatures with very different nervous systems could experience pain. Each type of mental state is multiply realised by various physical states. A non-reductionist moral naturalist might want to say the same thing about moral properties. The same kind of thing, anyway. Okay, well, we'll look in detail at some specific forms of moral naturalism in the next videos. But before doing that, I think it's worth noting some of the just general benefits and costs of moral naturalism overall. So first of all, in terms of the benefits of moral naturalism, well, there's a fairly obvious appeal to this view. On the one hand, being a realist view, it has all of the benefits that moral realism can bring, which we've already discussed in this series, so I won't go over those again. But the key point is there are many people who are attracted to moral realism, and that's what you get with moral naturalism. But furthermore, naturalism has some fairly obvious advantages over the non-naturalist variety of moral realism. If the moral naturalist can defend the idea that moral properties are natural properties, and that we can come to know the moral facts using the same kind of methodology that we apply in empirical domains, if the moral naturalist can defend that idea, then it looks like we solve the problems of the queerness of moral properties and the epistemological problems about how could we access moral properties. As we saw, these are big problems for non-naturalism. Moral properties just seem weird, right? The naturalist thinks that she can find a home for moral properties in our everyday conception of the world. More generally, of course, most philosophers these days endorse some form or another of naturalism as a general metaphysical thesis. Most philosophers are physicalists. They think that the world consists of nothing more than protons and neutrons and other fundamental physical particles as described by physics. This naturalist commitment seems to be one of the primary motivations for moral anti-realism. So by marrying moral realism with naturalism, the moral naturalist overcomes an important source of resistance to the moral realist project. Of course, this is all assuming that some form of moral naturalism can be made to work, right? And as I say, we'll look at some more specific proposals in the next videos. Okay, a second point in favour of moral naturalism is the supervenience argument. So this begins with the point that moral facts supervene on the natural facts. Now, supervenience. So for anyone unaware of this terminology, I'd better just explain what this means. We say that some set of properties X supervenes on some other set of properties Y, just in case there can be no difference in the X properties without a difference in the Y properties. To change the X properties, you would have to change the Y properties. For example, if you consider the words on your computer screen at the moment, these words supervene on the arrangement of pixels, because there can be no difference in the words without a difference in the colours in the pixels. That's fairly obvious, right? If you want to have a different word displayed on the screen, you'll have to alter the colours of the pixels. And of course, in this case, the supervenience relation arises from the fact that the words just are constituted by the arrangement of the pixels, right? The words on the screen are nothing but a particular arrangement of coloured pixels. So when we say that moral facts supervene on natural facts, we mean there can be no change in the moral facts without a change in the natural facts. Among people who are willing to postulate moral facts, this is uncontroversial. Imagine that I do something that you judge to be morally wrong. Let's say I kill somebody and steal their money. Well, in order for that action to become morally acceptable, surely some of the natural facts would have to change. Either my behaviour would have to be different, or something in the surrounding environment would have to be different. We would find it kind of incomprehensible for somebody to pass a different moral judgment about the same action done in the same context for the same reasons. So, the moral supervenes on the natural. But this is actually rather striking. I mean, why should this be? Why should this supervenience relation hold? Why isn't it possible to change the moral properties without changing the natural properties? Well, the naturalist has a simple explanation, because the naturalist will say the moral supervenes on the natural because the moral facts just are natural facts. In the same way that the words on your screen are constituted by the pixels, or the properties of a biological organism are constituted by the arrangement of molecules, similarly the moral facts are constituted by various biological, psychological and social facts. Now, obviously, non-naturalists can't appeal to this explanation. For the non-naturalist, the moral facts are something over and above the natural facts. So why is there such a tight connection between the moral and the natural? It's not at all clear how to even begin answering this question from the non-naturalist approach. But one thing we might say here is, well, should we actually accept this supervenience claim? So Nicholas Sturgeon, in his article in the Oxford Handbook of Ethical Theory, argues no, we shouldn't. Sturgeon himself, I should say, is a naturalist who accepts the supervenience claim, but he says he accepts it because he's a naturalist. So we can frame this in terms of possible worlds. Let's take two possible worlds, both with exactly the same natural properties. Now, they cannot differ in their moral properties, at least according to a naturalist. But now suppose that although they do not differ in their natural properties, they do differ in their supernatural properties. Exactly what these supernatural properties would be, well, who knows? But let's suppose they have some supernatural properties, and they differ in those supernatural properties. Well, then there is no reason why the moral facts would have to be the same in each world. Since non-naturalists think that moral properties are non-natural, then it turns out they have no reason to accept the supervenience claim. So maybe this argument can be avoided, although it is worth noting that if you doubt supervenience, you seem to raise an even more serious epistemological problem for non-naturalism. If we're supposing that moral facts can differ while the natural facts do not, right? That the moral facts can change while the natural facts remain the same. Well, how do we access these non-natural moral facts? Presumably it's going to be through some faculty of intuition, but our intuitions are responses to the natural facts that we're presented with. Hence, our intuitions aren't going to vary in the face of the same natural facts. So denying supervenience would arguably lead the non-naturalist into some even more serious epistemological troubles. Okay then, anyway, hopefully that gives you some sense of why many philosophers find moral naturalism appealing. Now I want to turn to some problems for moral naturalism. We'll begin with a couple of historical problems that were historically important and so are worth discussing for that reason, but that are no longer really treated as raising serious difficulties for the moral naturalist project. During the first half of the 20th century, moral naturalism was very much out of fashion. A lot of philosophers considered it to be pretty much refuted, and it's worth exploring why that was. One major objection to moral naturalism arises from the is-ought gap, the claim that we cannot infer an ought from an is. I think we discussed this way back in the first video in the Metaethics series, but let's briefly go over it again. The idea is we can't derive normative statements, which are statements about how the world ought to be, from descriptive statements, which are statements about how the world is. So consider this argument. Premise 1, humans will feel pain if you hit them. Premise 2, Frank is a human. Conclusion, you ought not to hit Frank. Now, that argument is just obviously invalid, right? That conclusion just doesn't follow from those premises. Now, you can add more descriptive premises, but the conclusion still won't follow, no matter how many descriptive premises you add. You might add, say, premise 3, pain is a form of suffering. Premise 4, Frank does not want to suffer, etc., etc. No matter how many descriptive statements you make, the argument is still going to be invalid. In order to make the argument valid, we would need a normative premise. We would need a premise such as, you ought not to inflict pain on humans, or something along those lines. And what this suggests is that there's an important distinction between descriptive statements and normative statements. It should be obvious why this poses a problem for the naturalist. According to naturalism, moral properties are natural properties. So moral statements are talking about the same things as descriptive statements. Moral properties are just like normal things in the world, just like protons or chairs or mountains or oceans. Furthermore, we infer moral conclusions on the basis of empirical evidence, on the basis of claims about people's behaviour. Those sorts of things will justify the attribution of moral properties to them. But moral statements are normative. They tell us how the world ought to be, whereas statements about natural properties are purely descriptive, telling us how the world is actually structured. And the is-ought gap seems to show that there's a fundamental difference between the normative and descriptive. Now, the is-ought gap is not really such a problem for moral naturalism. I don't think this is considered to be a very good argument anymore. And to understand why, we need to note that there are at least two ways of understanding what's being claimed when somebody claims there is an is-ought gap. So on the first way to understand this, on the first reading, the is-ought gap is just making a simple logical point, a simple point about deductive logic. You cannot, as a matter of logic, derive a conclusion containing an ought claim from premises that do not contain any ought claims. Now this is uncontroversial, but this just arises from the conservativeness of logic. The conclusions of a valid inference are always in some sense contained within the premises. You don't get more out of a conclusion, you don't get more out of a deductively valid argument than what you put in, basically. Charles Pigden, in his article on naturalism in Blackwell's Companion to Ethics, has a nice analogy here. He says, well, just as you can't derive an ought from an is, you can't derive conclusions about hedgehogs from premises that do not explicitly say anything about hedgehogs. Just try it for yourself. Let's consider this argument, right? Premise 1, Frank is a small mammal. Premise 2, Frank has spikes on his back. Premise 3, Frank is a member of the subfamily, whatever that word is. Conclusion, Frank is a hedgehog. That's invalid. It's obviously invalid. And we could attribute to Frank literally every single property of hedgehogs. So to anyone who knows anything about hedgehogs, it's obvious that Frank is a hedgehog. Indeed, we can even say that Frank is a member of the subfamily, whatever that word is, which is just the definition of hedgehog. But unless we include a statement of the form, if Frank has properties A, B, C, then Frank is a hedgehog, or unless we include a premise asserting a synonymy between Erin, whatever that word is, and hedgehog, then we won't be able to logically derive the conclusion that Frank is a hedgehog. So you can't get a hedgehog conclusion from non-hedgehog premises. So there is, in a sense, a gap between statements about hedgehogs and statements that aren't about hedgehogs. But that tells us nothing about hedgehogs, right? It tells us something about the nature of deductive logic. It doesn't tell us anything about hedgehogs. Nobody would conclude from this that hedgehogs are totally different kinds of things from anything else in the world, that hedgehogs must be non-natural objects. The gap here is created by the conservativeness of logic. So, that is the first reading of the is-ought gap. On the second reading of the is-ought gap, we're asserting that there is some radical distinction between normative claims and descriptive claims. An ought can't be constituted by an is. A normative property can't be constituted by a natural descriptive property. The normative and the descriptive are just two fundamentally different kinds of thing. Now, if this is true, the naturalist is in trouble. Indeed, I suppose on this reading, the is-ought gap basically amounts to a denial of naturalism. But the problem is that if this is what you have in mind with the is-ought gap, then it's not at all obvious. It's highly controversial, and it certainly isn't supported by the is-ought gap on the first reading. To evaluate the claim that normative properties can't be constituted by descriptive properties, we need to consider the case for and against naturalism. Okay then, a second argument, highly influential during the first half of the 20th century, was Moore's open question argument. I think I've probably mentioned this before in the series, but we'll have a look at it again. You can skip this section if you want. Anyway, Moore begins by constructing what he calls closed and open questions. Consider the following questions. Frank is a bachelor, but is he unmarried? Or maybe something like, is it really true that all bachelors are unmarried? Well, the answer to these questions is obviously yes. Right? And Moore says that these questions are closed in the sense that there can be no substantive debate about them. The answer is trivial. Indeed, they strike us as strange questions to ask, because once we understand the meaning of the term bachelor, we know immediately that if a person is a bachelor, then that person is unmarried. A bachelor is just defined to mean unmarried man. So to ask something like, well, Frank is a bachelor, but is he really unmarried? That's just a really strange thing to ask. So a question is closed when the meaning of the terms used in stating the question makes the answer clear. By contrast, a question is open if the answer is not decided by the meaning of the terms. Was David Hume the greatest Western philosopher? Should I steal this book if I can't afford to pay for it? Are all owls nocturnal? Clearly we need to know more than just the meaning of the terms to answer these questions. Now Moore's claim is this. If the question is an X a Y, if that question is open, then we can't simply define X as Y. The fact that the question is open shows that X and Y are two different concepts. I mean, if they were the same concept, the question would strike us as trivial, right? If these were the same thing, if X was defined as a Y. So Moore then applies this test to naturalistic definitions of goodness. Consider the attempt to identify goodness with some natural property. So to take some naturalist claims that were popular around Moore's time, one view was that goodness is pleasure. So X is good means that X is pleasurable. Another view was that goodness is a matter of what we desire to desire. So on this view, X is good means X is what we desire to desire. Well, the trouble with these analyses is that we can generate open questions. When I say X is pleasurable, but is it really good? Or X is what we desire to desire, but is it really good? It looks like we could have a substantive debate about these questions. To say that pleasurable things are good, that's not simply trivial. It's not like saying pleasurable things are pleasurable. So Moore thinks goodness can't be defined to mean pleasure, and he thinks the same will go for every other naturalistic definition of goodness. Every time we try to identify goodness with some natural property P, the question X is P, but is X really good? That will be an open question, which shows that goodness cannot be identified with P, and so goodness is not a natural property. Now, Moore's argument was highly influential for many decades, and many took it to raise a serious challenge to moral naturalism. These days, it's not considered so powerful. There are a number of different ways of diffusing Moore's challenge, but I'll just note a couple of the more important responses. First of all, one major objection to Moore's argument, at least if it's presented as an argument against moral naturalism, is that it confuses a question of semantics with a question of metaphysics. What Moore's test establishes, at best, is that the term good is not synonymous with some other term P, where P is a term for a natural property. But it may still be the case that good and P refer to the same thing. By analogy, consider the terms water and H2O. Now, water is H2O, so the terms water and H2O refer to the same property. But at the same time, it's pretty obvious that the term water doesn't just mean H2O. After all, for much of human history, people were not aware that water was H2O. Discovering this fact was something that took serious empirical work. It was an interesting and substantive discovery, and if I were to say something like, well, X is H2O, but is it really water? That's an open question, because it's at least logically possible that chemists are wrong about the nature of water. We might, in the future, revise this claim. So the general point then is that two terms with different meanings can pick out the same property. And this point is especially important when we bear in mind the two forms of moral naturalism that I mentioned earlier. Many naturalists reject reductionism. Many naturalists will accept that we can't reduce moral language to non-moral vocabulary in the same way as we can't reduce biological language to the language of physics. Non-reductive naturalists will be quite happy to accept that normative terms are not synonymous with terms describing natural properties, in just the same way as a biological term such as cell is not synonymous with any proposition expressed purely in the language of physics. Nevertheless, a cell is ultimately constituted out of fundamental physical particles. So at best, Moore's argument can only target the reductive naturalist, the naturalist who argues that normative language can be analysed in terms of naturalistic language. In fact, though, even reductive naturalists have responses to Moore's argument. One important response is that the argument is too general. If the open question argument works, it will rule out not just the reduction of moral language to non-moral language, it will rule out the possibility of any informative conceptual analysis. Conceptual analysis is one of the primary tools of philosophy. We use it to try to break down concepts into their constituent parts. Consider, for instance, the claim that knowledge is justified true belief. This is an analysis of the concept knowledge. We're specifying the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as knowledge. Now, if it's true that knowledge is justified true belief, then it's true in virtue of the meaning of the terms. It's a conceptual truth. But what's more, if it's true, it seems to be informative. It tells us something interesting about our concept of knowledge. So, point is, there can be statements that are analytically true, so that there are statements that are true in virtue of their meaning, but whose truth is not obvious. It's not just obvious that knowledge is justified true belief. We don't immediately see that in the way that we immediately see that all bachelors are unmarried. So if I were to say, Frank has justified true belief that P, but does Frank really know that P? Well, that's an open question. That's something we can have a substantive debate about it, and, well, in fact, philosophers do debate it. There's no consensus at all on the definition of knowledge. That's a big part of epistemology. Nevertheless, it may be the case that knowledge is justified true belief. Or maybe it's defined some other way, but philosophers tend to assume that there is a correct conceptual analysis of knowledge, even if they disagree on what exactly that analysis looks like. As a general methodology, conceptual analysis is based on the assumption that we are sometimes unable to articulate the meanings of our concepts. In particular, we may be unable to see all the logical entailments of our concepts, and how a concept relates to other concepts. Conceptual facts are not always obvious to us. One of the tasks of philosophy is to chart out conceptual space. So it's perhaps analogous to how we can know how to ride a bike without knowing why we're able to stay on the bike. To explain how we're able to keep the bike stable, we will have to appeal to various biological and mechanical facts that we might not know about. Similarly, we can use a concept successfully without knowing everything about its meaning and what it entails. So the thought would be, well, maybe goodness is just pleasure, or like maybe goodness, right, just means pleasure, and that's a conceptual fact, but that need not be as obvious as the conceptual fact that, you know, bachelors are unmarried. I mean, that's obviously a very simple reductive analysis, but you know, the same could go if you propose some more sophisticated, more complex reductive analysis. So those were two problems that historically were seen as fairly serious obstacles for naturalism, but which most naturalists think have now been resolved. And of course, I mean, there is still debate about this. There are ways of defending the open question argument, or at least arguments very much like the open question argument. But the general consensus, as far as I can tell, is that naturalists do have some pretty plausible responses to it. Now, before ending this video, I want to raise a fairly major objection that is still very much in play, and that is raised against basically all forms of moral naturalism. It's worth keeping this objection in mind when we examine the more specific forms of moral naturalism in the next videos, to ask yourself whether they can overcome it, and this is the problem of normativity. The basic concern here is that moral naturalism fails to capture the normativity of morality. And normativity is something absolutely essential to morality. Moral facts concern what is good and what we have reasons to do. Moral facts are normative. Natural facts are facts about the arrangements and interactions of matter and the causal laws that govern these arrangements and interactions of matter. Natural facts are not normative. And it's just obvious. Many people think that these are different kinds of facts. So we might put the argument as follows. Natural facts are not normative. Normativity is a non-negotiable feature of morality. And when I say it's a non-negotiable feature, that is to say this is something that every metaethical theory has to capture, right? Because otherwise you're just not, if you're not talking about normativity, then you're just not talking about morality anymore, right? You're just changing the subject. If you have a theory of something and it doesn't capture normativity. And so the conclusion is moral facts are not natural facts. This objection is sometimes literally called the just too different objection. Right? Moral facts and natural facts are just too different for the moral to be constituted by the natural. So that's the basic concern. Now, there's no question that intuitively natural facts are not normative, and indeed, this intuition is probably what lies behind the substantive readings of the is-ought gap and arguments like the open question argument or Mackey's queerness argument. It just seems obvious to many people that natural facts do not capture normativity. But why is this? What exactly is it that's missing in the naturalist proposals? I mean, there's quite a strong claim being made here. Right? This is an argument that's raised against all forms of naturalism in principle. And so it's a strong claim, but it's not immediately obvious why natural facts can't capture normativity. I mean, that's the intuition, but why is this? So in the article, the just too different objection to normative naturalism, Hille Pakunainen, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, you'll have to look up the article, I guess, but Pakarinen, we're going to go with that pronunciation, distinguishes a few different forms of the normativity objection. Now I'm actually altering his presentation somewhat, or maybe it's her, I'm not sure. I'm altering this person's presentation somewhat, but the general ideas are the same. So first of all, there is the asymmetry of because explanations. And the basic idea of this is that normative facts obtain because of the natural facts. When we say that some action X is morally right, well, it's morally right because it has certain natural properties that make it right. The natural properties ground or produce the rightness. So to take a specific example, suppose we identify the normative property of being morally right with the natural property of being welfare maximizing. Well, if we identify X as being morally right with X as being welfare maximizing, then it would make no sense to say that X is right because it is welfare maximizing. If we're saying that X is right because it's welfare maximizing, then we're postulating an asymmetric relation between the rightness and the welfare maximization. We're saying that the latter brings about the former. And that is something then that cannot be captured by naturalism. Just to point out an interesting thing about this argument actually is that in many ways it's turning the supervenience argument, which we saw was used in favour of naturalism, against the naturalist, or at least what the naturalist has missed in the supervenience argument is that the supervenience holds in virtue of the fact that natural facts bring about the moral facts. And that bringing about, that's something that isn't captured by saying that moral facts just are natural facts. Or so the objection goes, right? So the objection goes. What is the response to this? Well, as Pakarinen points out, there do actually seem to be because explanations which identify the explanandum with the explanans. Which identify the thing to be explained with the thing doing the explaining. So, for example, the property of being water is identical with the property of being H2O. Yet, Pakarinen says it's perfectly sensible to say that X is water because X is H2O. Because water is just the stuff with that particular chemical composition. And this is because when we say that water is H2O, we're not just saying that these two terms refer to the same thing. We're giving a property analysis of water. We're breaking down the property of water into its components. And each individual component, the hydrogen atoms, the oxygen atoms, the relations between them, and so on, that's different from the property of being water. It's the special combination of the components into H2O that is identical to the property of water. So when we say that X is H2O when we say that X is water because X is H2O, that is an acceptable explanation because it's spelling out the inner complexity of water. On the other hand, it wouldn't be a good explanation to say that X is H2O because X is water. That wouldn't be a sensible thing to say, or so Pakarinen thinks. So naturalists will say that because explanations can hold between identical properties, at least in given the right sort of context, given the right investigative context, I guess. Okay, so a second thing that naturalism arguably misses is that normative facts involve a reference to standards. Intuitively, the fact that X is welfare maximizing isn't in itself a moral fact. There is only a moral fact in the further fact that X as being welfare maximizing makes X right. Or in other words, that X as being welfare maximizing makes X satisfy the standards of rightness. Moral facts therefore involve an implicit reference to standards. Without some standard of rightness, maximizing welfare would no more be right than minimizing welfare. But of course, natural facts alone do not make any reference to standards. So we can't identify moral facts with natural facts. Now, Pakaninen's response to this is basically just to deny that we need to think of moral facts as involving a reference to standards. Let's suppose the naturalist holds that rightness is identical to welfare maximization. Well, in that case, she has offered a property analysis of rightness. And in that case, the fact that something is welfare maximising really is, in itself, already a moral fact. No further reference to standards is required. The question would just be whether or not you accept the naturalist's property analysis. But obviously, we have to consider the independent arguments for and against it, right? Like if it's the case that there are problems with treating rightness as constituted by welfare maximisation, then sure, we will have to say that the fact that X is welfare maximising isn't in itself a moral fact. But if the naturalist's analysis goes through, well, there's no problem. We can just straightforwardly accept that X is a moral fact. So this Paganinian thinks just isn't really an issue. Okay then, the third way to run the normativity objection is to say that naturalism cannot capture the motivational force of morality. The idea of this is that moral judgments move us. If I judge that giving to charity is morally good, this will provide me with some motivation to give to charity. Judging that killing is wrong provides me with some motivation not to kill. Natural facts, on the other hand, can't motivate us to do anything. Now, we've already discussed this objection. This is an objection that is used by many non-cognitivists against any form of cognitivism. The argument is that moral judgments motivate us, but beliefs in themselves never motivate us. So moral judgments aren't beliefs. They don't express beliefs. So it's not obvious that this is a problem for naturalism specifically. Remember, the normativity problem is supposed to be a problem for naturalism. And it's an argument that's often used by realist non-naturalists. Right? Realist non-naturalists will claim that naturalism fails to capture some important feature of the normative facts. But it's not clear how any beliefs about non-natural facts could in themselves motivate us either, right? If you think it's the case that beliefs can't motivate us, then obviously you're not going to think that beliefs about non-natural facts can motivate us either. So as I say, this is just a general objection, and so I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because we have already talked about it. But I do want to note one response here. So Nicholas Sturgeon, in the aforementioned article in the Oxford Handbook of Ethical Theory, responds that moral judgments actually don't necessarily motivate us. It's entirely possible to sincerely judge that giving to charity is good without feeling any motivation whatsoever to give to charity. The reason why this objection seems compelling, according to Sturgeon, is that there is a close connection between moral judgment and motivation. And this is essentially due to common cause. Morality is concerned with promoting human goods, promoting pleasure, promoting cooperation, resolving conflict, promoting social stability, general welfare, and so on. And as it happens, these are just the sort of things that most of us care about. These are just the sort of things that most of us desire. We desire cooperation and social stability and pleasure. So, we have a motivation to get at these things. So to take, for instance, simple utilitarianism, which tells us to act so as to maximise pleasure. Well, we care about pleasure. We want to bring pleasure to ourselves. Most of us also care about bringing pleasure to others. We would prefer to live in a world where people are happy and the suffering is reduced. In various ways then, it turns out that we have desires that are in line with the moral values. Now, of course, sometimes our desires conflict. We have all sorts of selfish desires and we may act on them. But even when you're acting selfishly, there's still probably a part of you that desires like flourishing for others. So when you spend money on a luxury for yourself rather than give to charity, it's still the case that you would prefer there to be no poverty in the world. That's what you desire. So the argument then is that morality doesn't motivate us, but what's morally good happens to be closely aligned with at least some of the things that we tend to desire. In particular, morality is closely aligned with our other regarding desires, with our desires that arise from our concern for other people. And so that's why it might seem as though moral judgments necessarily motivate us. Right then, a fourth version of the normativity problem is that moral naturalism fails to capture categorical reasons. Recall back in the video on error theory we distinguished hypothetical from categorical imperatives, Moral judgments involve categorical imperatives. To say that slavery is wrong means you ought not to own slaves, and you can't release yourself from this imperative by citing any of your desires or goals. Morality has a special kind of authority over us in that it provides reasons for action that are independent of our desires. I ought not to enslave people, no matter what my desires are. Now, how could any natural fact, any fact about the arrangement of matter, provide a reason for action that's independent of my desires? The fact that there's chocolate cake at the shop provides me with a reason to go to the shop, but that's dependent on my desire to accumulate chocolate cake. So it's just difficult to see how you could build desire-independent reasons into the world. Now, again, the naturalist might appeal to a response along the lines of the previous one. The idea would be, well, actually, moral facts don't provide reasons for action. Moral facts needn't involve categorical imperatives. Let's take the traditional Humean view that you only have a reason to do X, either when you have a desire for X, or when you have a desire to do some other thing Y, and X is a means of achieving Y. So basically, reasons are dependent on desires. In this case, moral facts don't in themselves provide reasons for action. But, as Sturgeon has argued, there's a close connection between morality and desire. So it's going to be the case that we typically desire what's in line with morality, and that will typically then, we're going to have a reason to do the moral thing. So we typically have a reason to act morally, but that's not essential to morality. Now, of course, the trouble with taking this kind of line is that you basically just seem to be giving up on the idea that morality tells us what we ought to do, independently of what we have a desire to do. I mean, the most that this response can do is explain why we have the intuition that morality provides categorical oughts. But it's not clear that this helps solve the problem. So, I mean, to see why this is a particularly difficult problem, let's suppose that we're able to naturalise some moral concepts. Suppose we succeed in showing that goodness is a natural property. Well, that doesn't tell us anything about what we ought to do, because we can still raise the question, how should we act with respect to goodness? One option would be to promote goodness, where we just try to maximise the amount of goodness in the world, even if that involves performing actions that in themselves reduce goodness. So this would be a kind of consequentialist approach. Maybe you shoot one person to save 5. The act of killing is that, like, killing somebody is a reduction in goodness, but you do it because overall goodness is maximised. Another option is to honour the goodness. So this involves only performing actions that are good in themselves, even if it leads to less goodness overall. Since the act of shooting one person involves taking a life, you don't do it even to save 5. That's a more deontological approach. And there are other options too, including like forms of egoism, for example. So we can see that a moral system doesn't just tell us what is valuable, it tells us how to act with respect to what is valuable. And it's difficult to see how to naturalise this latter aspect. Even if you show that goodness is a natural property, you've got a further hurdle to show that the ought claim is a natural property. That something like you ought to maximise goodness, right? How could that be a natural fact? What part? How does that arise out of the arrangement of matter in the world? So that's an aspect of this that I think proves somewhat tricky for naturalists. Okay then, so a fifth and final way to elaborate the problem of normativity is just to appeal to brute intuition. And this seems to be David Enoch's view in his book, Taking Morality Seriously. Enoch says that many of us have the strong intuition that moral facts are just too different from natural facts. But he thinks there isn't actually any non-question begging argument in support of this intuition. You either share the intuition or you don't. As it happens, many of us do share it. Even many naturalists feel the force of it to some extent, although they will try to show that it's misleading. And this intuition counts against the moral naturalist project. It doesn't rule moral naturalism out. If some moral naturalist theory is provided which scores well on other theoretical virtues, then that will be a reason to abandon the intuition. But still, you know, the fact that we have this intuition, this very strong intuition, that's at least reason to be a little bit skeptical of naturalism. So most naturalists, most people who object to moral naturalism on the basis of this problem of normativity, on the basis of the idea that natural facts can't be normative facts, they will try to explain exactly why this is, right? Like exactly what it is that natural facts can't capture, like about normativity. On this view, we just have the intuition that the natural can't be normative, and that's that. But that intuition is claimed to be at least a count against moral naturalism. Philosophers often appeal to their intuitions. I suppose it can be sometimes difficult to see what else they might appeal to, right? I mean, we can't go out and do experiments. So this is a perhaps a weaker argument, but that is an approach that some people have taken on this problem. Okay, finally, I should note that one option for the moral naturalist, whatever form the problem of normativity takes, is just to bite the bullet and accept the objection, to accept that natural facts are not normative, or at least they don't capture part of normativity. So she can then argue in favour of a reforming definition of morality. Compare, for example, the definition of motion. It seems arguable that the folk concept of motion, the common sense understanding of motion, involves absolute motion. People might think that there is some fact about how fast an object is really moving that is not dependent on some specific reference frame. And of course we know that's wrong, right? All motion is relative. If I ask the question, how fast is the Earth moving? Well, you have to say relative to what? Relative to Mars, relative to the Sun, relative to the galactic centre. Choosing a different reference frame will give you a different speed, and none of those reference frames is privileged. So there is no absolute motion, only relative motion. And so if the folk concept of motion does include absolute motion, then the folk concept is to that extent mistaken. But of course, on discovering the relativity of motion, we didn't just stop talking about motion. Instead, the concept was reformed. We now use a slightly different concept, which allows us to make much more accurate claims about the world, but which is close enough to the previous concept that we can treat them as basically the same. The naturalist might say that we can do the same with morality. She can say that, yes, the folk concept of morality involves, say, an idea of categorical reasons, and it turns out that there are no categorical reasons in the natural world, but that doesn't really matter, because we can just do away with categorical reasons and still have something close enough to folk morality, just as we did away with absolute motion, but we still have something close enough to the folk concept of motion. So this is one route for a moral naturalist to take, is to attempt to give a kind of reforming definition of morality, to accept that we might lose some of the folk concept in doing this reduction of the moral facts to the natural facts. But the thing is that, well, whenever we reduce like our common sense beliefs to, whenever we show how common sense properties or the properties of common sense can be reduced to natural properties, often part of that common sense conception is lost. We don't retain all of it. So that's maybe one way we can go on this. Okay, that's all for today. Yeah, in many ways this is really just an introductory video. In the next videos I'm going to examine in detail a couple of naturalist theories, but hopefully that's given you a sense of why moral naturalism is appealing in general and the kinds of problems it tends to face. Goodbye.